Thank you all for joining us roughly in time. We have one panelist still missing, but I think we should nevertheless start. So you know the theme of this session. It's about transforming the digital marketplace on the African continent. I'm Pascal Lamy. My main background is trade, but trade has many facets, including digital trade, e-commerce, e-trade, so I sometimes allow myself to step in this part of the trade universe. I think the starting point is fairly simple. There is a wide consensus that the digitalization of the economy offers a huge leapfrogging opportunity to this continent. Thanks to the capacity of IT to cross distance, to disintermediate old systems, there is a huge economic and social potential there. Cheaper, faster, I don't think I need to make this case. So the real question is, how can this potential be unleashed? What sort of issues, challenges getting there raises? If you listen to what the market or government says, it sometimes has to do with infrastructure, with affordability, with interoperability, with payment systems, with digital literacy, with continental or regional integration. And this is true for business. And there are a number of new business models coming in, as it is for government, because there's obviously a very strong either infrastructure or regulatory responsibility. So the aim of the discussion is to try and leave this room in 55 minutes with a bit of a clearer idea of what is to be done in Africa in order to move in this direction. Panelists around this table, as usual in the WEF, are a mix of people coming from different horizons. We have Tobias Becker from ABB, who heads the African program. I don't need to introduce ABB, I think. We have Elisabeth Migwalla, who's the government affair for Qualcomm. We have Minister Cwele, who's the man on IT for the South African government. And we have Bruno Kone, who's waiting. And we have you to my left, who are the head of the Google strategic partnership. So mix of private-public. The plan is as follows. Each of the panelists will have a bit of time to answer this question. Then I'll try and trigger a bit of interaction within the panel, then interaction with you. And then at the end, we'll try to wrap up, again, to facilitate the understanding of what the main issues are. So why don't we start with you, the only lady on the panel, so it creates a sort of natural priority.
Well, thank you very much, and I grabbed that opportunity with both hands. So the perspective I want to bring to the discussion is that there are more Africans off the internet than there are on. And for that population, a digital marketplace is not a possibility. And the reason I say that is for you to be on the internet, you need to be on some network. So when you look at this vast majority of the population that is not connected, you can view them from various perspectives. And I want to start with those that I call on the edge. And those are the populations that are living in areas that do not have any coverage. Those are the people who have never made one call, be it voice or data, okay? The other category of the unconnected are those who are actually in coverage, but the coverage they have is capable of voice and data activity. So if they're talking about the digital marketplace, it probably doesn't exist. But there's also a third category of those who are within the broadband coverage, but are not benefiting from the coverage because really coverage does not a service make. So I think when we start this discussion, it's the question that I think I'm passionate about is what do we need to do to get those populations onto the network? Because if we do not do that, we will be overseeing an increased disparity. And having said that, I think that for the realities of Africa, you're likely to find that mobile broadband may offer the solution for connectivity. And we all know that mobile has been a really successful revolution. And maybe we need to look at what it is that made mobile successful and why has it been so difficult to replicate that success in the data arena. So as we start this discussion, I want to almost challenge all of us to maybe rethink some of perhaps the policy and the implementation frameworks that we are so used to. For instance, we know that the plan has been to have licensed operators, 2 or 3 in a country, licensed to transact throughout the country. Is that really going to get the connectivity to the edge? For instance, we also know that the users in the village, for instance, those who have never made a call, what is it that they want to do? Have we had a chance to, speak with them? They could perhaps be operators for themselves. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I'm saying is that if technology was all we needed, the technological innovations are there, and they are better yet to come. If current policies were able to serve our people, it would have happened. I put it to you that perhaps there's more that needs to be done to make this digital marketplace a reality for those who are not on the network today. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Very clear. So, bridging the digital divide as we see it. Minister Cwele, what's your take?
Thank you very much. I think in a country like South Africa, which is a developing country, which is coming from apartheid past, the digital divide is there. So the key issue is that I think as a country, and most of the countries in Africa, we really embrace this digitization. And what is driving it, if you check what are the people, why they're using this internet, those who have got access, I agree with my sisters. The access issues are very critical. But there is also an element of trust. How do we build the trust for people to use and do this transaction and this digital economy and so on? That's why it's very important. In South Africa, in that relation, we have got this, like other countries, this set. We call it National Cybersecurity Hub, where we are able to assist businesses, particularly small business and big business, if they meet difficulties, so that there can be more increased trust in the use of the internet. And because some of the smaller businesses may not have the resources to deal with the challenges which we may have there. It will really assist us to really leapfrog. The question is, what do you do in a constitutional democracy like ours, where there's a stronger move that the rights you have offline must be the same right you have online? But those we can deal with in terms of policy. I don't think that's a big challenge as far as we're concerned, because we're open to the issues of access are very critical, and affordability are quite critical. And, but also the legal frameworks will have to really adapt to these new realities. As we move to this adaptation, the only thing we really concern, where do you keep this information? Where are these data centers? I think if we have to increase the uptake in Africa, we really have to assist having other regional data centers or national data centers, so that at least there's some trust that the information is somehow protected and the costs are not being pushed very, very high. The other aspect we are looking at, because as we go to higher levels, we are still looking at basic internet access in Africa than 5Gs and 7Gs, which is critical because out of these 3.2 billion which is connected, there's very little coming from our region. And the bulk of the people will be more difficult to connect are coming from here. Some of the initiatives we're doing really is to get at least the local leadership of municipalities to give basic package of service, of access to internet to all the citizens in those municipalities. The bigger municipalities will make some of them free, but they are not really free because somebody is paying for them. They pay them through their local taxes, what they call rates in South Africa. But that has really increased the access quite dramatically. It's driven by bigger cities at the moment. And for people to find the use of the internet. And we've done some legal studies. And what are the people using this thing for, particularly in countries like ours? The bulk of the young people who are using and old people who are using this internet, they're using it either for looking for jobs, looking for access for government services. So digitization of government services is going to become a priority because that's a bulk of the content the people are looking for. And it is a local content, it is a content they understand. But others are doing it to improve their businesses and competitiveness. And the key challenge to us as we do this and open these markets, because when you open the markets, we realize greater consumer benefit, is how do you deal with the balance that you don't kill your small and medium enterprises in Africa? We are entering this market at a higher speed. The issue about rural areas to me, as I conclude, is that the demand is there, even among those who are poor. That's why they use what is affordable to them now. We talk about the social media. It's the biggest driver of the use of the internet in our country at this stage. It's growing day by day, so it means there is a market, but we have to balance those things of security, making sure that we also protect small and emerging businesses.
Thanks very much. So we have a sort of first glance at what public policy priorities should be according to you. Charles, back to the private sector,
yes.
And then we'll go to Tobias. What's your take?
So my take is very simple. Over the next 5 years, the global population will be about 8 billion. And therefore, when you take your 3 billion number that's currently online, it clearly states that we need to figure out how we're going to get the next 5 billion people online. Because, for instance, for us as Google, our mission statement is simple. It's about creating an ecosystem whereby every single person has access to information in a useful manner. And therefore, we take the prism of making sure that we're looking at how we can access that, create that access to information for everyone. Whether you're in New York or Nairobi, it should be the same. And even if you're not in Nairobi, you're in a remote place like Lodwar in Kenya, you should still have that same access to information. For Africa specifically, to come back a bit closer, there'll be 400 million new people getting online over the next 5 years by 2020. And so what are we going to be able to do to make sure that as they get online, they do take advantage of the economic impact that being online creates for them? Because we believe that being online and the internet is a net contributor to economic growth. So we have to look at it from that economic growth standpoint. And so when you're looking at it from a global standpoint, right now as we stand, the e-commerce business drives over $300 billion of annual economic impact and an additional $300 billion in productivity growth. So these are really big numbers, and we need to figure out how we can, as Africans, take advantage of that and make sure that it's trickling down to the most remote parts of our continent. So as Google, we take a three-pronged approach. We look at it through the prism of access, we look at it from another prism of content, and as well as education. And access is saying we want to work with public sector as well as other organizations to increase access across Africa to make sure that people have that access. So we work very closely with telcos and some of the projects that we have which are longer term, such as Project Link in Accra and also in Kampala, lay actual backbone fiber to deliver that access to the people. The second part, and that's mostly for densely populated cities. But for more remote parts, we're looking at things like Project Loon, which in essence will collaborate with telcos to deliver connectivity to the most sparsely populated parts of Africa. When it comes to the content side, we're working very closely with businesses to get them online, because you can look at it through two different prisms. One is scripted content, which is more entertainment or informational. But on the other hand, you look at it from the listings. So especially for this particular panel where we're talking about transforming the digital marketplace, it really falls into that particular square of saying, how do we get more businesses online so that they can reap the fruits of that e-commerce space? And then last but not least is education. And when you look at education, we need to build a skilled workforce which can be able to actually take advantage of that 300 billion plus of productivity that the world gets from e-commerce every year.
That's very clear. So if I understand well what you said, access has a lot to do with governments, content has a lot to do with business, and digital literacy has to do with both.
And ties everything together.
Yeah.
And the way we say is that every single business is actually a digital business. So we need to make sure that we reap the fruits. Whether you're selling T-shirts in Kigali or you are a tech entrepreneur, you should still think of your business as a digital business.
Thanks a lot. Tobias.
Yeah, I would like to shed an additional aspect or a glance on the marketplace, digital marketplace. In our thinking, to drive a marketplace, you need obviously people with an entrepreneurial idea. For a digital marketplace, you need access to the internet, and you need access to electric power. You need that to be able to make something. Whether you want to process something or you want to ship something, if you want to store something, whatever you want to do with a real good, real world good, actually you need power to do that, you need energy. Now, the good thing is the challenge finds a paradigm change at the moment that might enable both these things, access to internet and access to power. The paradigm change we see is that renewable power has come down very much, so that we can bring electric power to people who cannot be connected to the power grid. For us as original inventors of the power grid, it's quite striking to see how Africa transforms itself into a wireless continent. Started with a wireless voice, wireless data, wireless banking, mobile cash, etc. But now we are also able to provide wireless power, off-grid solutions, so that we can bring electric power to the most remote places in the country. If you look at it, it's important for Africa because 53% of all people in the world who don't have access to power live in Africa. Our studies show that out of those, 80% will not economically be connected to the power grid in the near future. but they need electric power to charge the mobile phones, of course, but also to do something, to make something, to produce something, whether they use information and process that, or they do a physical good. They need electric power for that. So the paradigm change of renewables coming down in cost, plus the ability to store electric power in batteries or other storage systems nowadays, and microgrids as a technology that allows to distribute this out to most rural places or most remote places, is a fantastic paradigm change. The other paradigm change we see has to do with the actual making of the things. We call it the fourth industrial revolution, or informatization. It means that the physical goods and the machinery that makes them is completely coated in information nowadays. So an electric motor that you might use in a food processing mill in a village a couple hundred kilometers away from the capital nowadays emanates a lot of information that allows people to optimize processes, to be more resource efficient, to cut down cost, to cut down energy consumption, and to allow vendors to remotely access the product, service it, maintain it, and keep it running. One of the big old problems in Africa of equipment standing still because of service issues can be bridged with the modern information technology. So these two paradigm changes we think are helping Africa to leapfrog, to become the wireless continent, and to leave behind all those intermediate steps that the old world, that Europe, let's say, has done. You don't need to do them. You can actually jump over those and directly go into the 21st century.
Okay, so I think we have a fairly comprehensive approach. Before we go to the questions from the audience, what would be your answer to this point that was made, that in a way access to data or to internet seems to be much slower and more difficult than access to voice, which we all will agree was a huge success and worked extremely well. So what's the difference? Why are there bottlenecks on internet or access to data which were not there when the mobile revolution totally contaminated the continent? What's your answer to that?
From our end, it's cost. Affordability is critical. When you look at most of the developed world, you have, on average, people spending on a monthly basis about 1.2% of their monthly earnings on data and communication. In Africa at the moment, it's still around 12%, which is exorbitantly high.
Now,
So
why is this cost so high?
it cuts across two sides. One is the actual cost of data, and two is the earning power that a lot of people.
I mean, what's the cost of data? Is it what it costs to ship data, or is it what you bill?
What people are billed at the end of the day. But also when you look at the cost of actually building the infrastructure, it's still very expensive. Because from a telco standpoint, laying fiber, I'll give you the example of Kampala, where we've laid about 1,000 kilometers of fiber backbone in Kampala. The reason we did that is because we can take a longer term view much faster than if a different local operator comes in, builds that fiber, and they need to make money and returns on that in a much shorter time frame. So what we have done as Google is we have made sure that we take a much longer term view, we wholesale that at a much lower cost, because we can amortize that in our books at a longer period, and hopefully that cost saving will trickle down to the end consumer. What we have seen is over 3,000% growth in the amount of data being consumed in Kampala, and that was only on the actual fiber backbone. Yeah. And then we went further and actually created a Wi-Fi zone around those nodes and took advantage of that. And again, we've seen a substantial growth in the amount of data being consumed. So affordability is definitely something that's critical.
Yeah, but what you're telling us, and I would like the others to react on that, is that there's a sort of trade-off. Lowering the cost increases traffic, so that at the end of the day, fees are decreasing, which is a bit what happened in this region within the EAC with this one area network they have, where they decided within the Eastern African community to zero progressively roaming charges. And those of us who followed that, and I did that with Trademark East Africa, saw this debate, people saying, oh, if roaming charges go down, hey, what about our P&L? And then the answer was, yeah, traffic will increase. And that's in reality what's happening. Now, is this a lesson for what we're saying? What's your reaction? Is this cost issue the main problem that makes a difference in data or internet access? Go ahead.
So the comment I'd make, first of all, is in terms of evolution or development, the kind of technologies that should avail data connectivity in our continent. The other regions of the world maybe adopted third generation and are now into fourth generation technologies. Now, on our continent, it is a process that is beginning to take place now. And seeing that many that we want to cover are in the rural areas, the spectrum resources that have been available up to this point have been more that are more suited for capacity in cities. But in the next dispensation, starting now, there is going to be resources that are better suited to cover rural areas, lower frequencies. Those are coming on stream now, and it's a question of evolution. So that's the one thing. So you'll see that mobile has reached where it has for several reasons. Firstly, it's standardization and economies of scale. So mobile broadband needs to reach that scale as well. So that's another aspect.
Your point is that this sort of standardization, which was necessary in order to disseminate mobile and voice, you have to do the same.
Yes, and it's being done.
Broadband, it's been done.
Yes.
And how is it been done? Is it been done nationally? Is it been done regionally? Is it been done continentally? I mean, we all know that seen from the moon, Africa has a specific problem, which is an incredible density of frontiers.
Yes.
And we know why. Let's not expand on why, but that's a characteristic of this continent. So do frontiers matter in this area? What should be done is again, take the example of here in the Eastern African community, they've put that as a priority to regionalize digitalization. Is it something you believe is a major issue?
Yes, I'd say so. Because going forward, there are just so many choices. And to the extent that the African continent can converge on a minimum, almost a minimum requirement to achieve the objectives, it becomes easier to talk about economies of scale. I'll just give you an example. We are talking about next generation communications. There's a whole lot of spectrum resources that you can use, but you need to package them in a certain way. So if we could have an agreement where all African countries have something that looks similar, it makes sense for manufacturers to standardize on that, and then you get the economies of scale. So technology is there, but there are choices. We need to narrow down on what suits this continent.
Okay, Minister Tobias, what's your view on that?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think also I strongly believe where there is no efficiency, cost will always be high. I think when we started our networks in South Africa, we pushed people to build parallel networks. And that's very costly. And so movement to sharing of networks, I think that's what is going to be key moving forward. Some form of sharing of these networks, we think that it will be efficient because really the cost of deploying these networks are still very high. The other challenge is when I said the backhaul infrastructure is still far from most of the villages. Because that's what everyone has to have a backhaul. whether using mobile, whether using Wi-Fi, whatever. So the extension of this backward infrastructure is still going to be quite critical.
But is it your experience, Minister, that building the necessary infrastructure, including in non-urban areas, is much more complex and difficult for data than it is for voice?
I think not necessarily that it's complex, but because we are following the same rollout which we started when we started with voice. So yet the technologies have changed, they've made it easier, but we're still going through that all because basically the competition is on infrastructure. If we continue to persist and insist that every competition must be on the infrastructure, whereas infrastructure could be shared, I mean, through private arrangements, through negotiated arrangements, but if we still say, because that's what becomes a barrier to entry, which will bring real competition. People are really competing just on the infrastructure. If you are small, we have captured the market, you can't participate. So we have to slowly move to services where because it's all about the consumer, how the consumer experiences this thing at the end of the day. So those are the things we think the biggest challenge in Africa, if we can have an arrangement, like you're saying, if we want to build this infrastructure across Africa, that countries must agree that we'll have the common approach to build this infrastructure, then we can invite the private sector then to play that role, but there should be an agreement. I think the example you have put of roaming costs, they are prohibitingly high. But there is no CEO who's going to bring these roaming costs away if they bring revenue to the company, and so on. So, but those are the things really where we have to look, because the number of people who are going to use this internet, they're increasing. Let's look more on the volumes rather than constricting the volumes and just increasing the price. So that will be the approach we really suggest that it will assist us in Africa. Thank you.
Good. Tobias, I mean, this lesson that key is the volume, and at the end of the day, if the volume is there, the thing will work the way it did on voice. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think if we look at those markets that have been overly successful in e-commerce, one being China, of course, having a big population and being more or less one country, though consisting of 5 major regions, or the US, agreeably having a very high spending power, which is a great thing to build a market as well. But the key element is that a small enterprise with a good idea can very quickly scale up and go nationwide. And this is the problem we have here in Africa. You go nationwide in Rwanda, you can cover 22 million people. That's not enough. So for e-commerce, boundaries need to be made permeable, or they need to vanish essentially, so that people can scale up. Otherwise, good ideas die because they only become profitable at a certain scale. The ideas are there. I'm blown away by seeing the entrepreneurial ideas here in Africa, especially in East Africa and Southern Africa, of creating business models and bringing ideas to fruition, where we in Europe are just looking at and saying, wow, this is amazing. The will is there, the ideas are there. Enlarge the marketplace, make the marketplace bigger.
Okay, so at this stage of the discussion, we've clearly focused the biggest issue on access. So the notion is that there are lots of people who would be ready to do that. Ideas are there, business models are there, experiences are there. We, I think, agree on the fact that there is still a bottleneck on access for a variety of reasons. Now, before we go to the audience, what's the main answer to that? How to unlock access? So you just told us standardization, economies of scale, which will help getting the volumes. That's a bit what Minister Cwele also said. I mean, is that something you agree on? Are there other issues in terms of beefing up fostering this access that you see we need to mention before going to the audience?
I think I would agree on the shared infrastructure is probably one of the most critical components, and we are driving that because it has to be, when you're talking about scale, it's when you have 300 million people within a confines of the size of Kenya, then you can build scale very quickly. When you only have 45 million, then it becomes more difficult. So you certainly need to figure out how you can drive shared infrastructure to take advantage of the scale that's there and reduce your cost. But I would actually also broaden the conversation and say access is critical, but skills are very, very key to that because they drive everything else that comes after the access component.
Right. But I mean, that's, I'm convinced you're right. The problem is that if this access increases, the incentive to increase the skills will be there, whereas it doesn't work the other way around.
The thing that we've seen is that even with the moderate access that's there at the moment, there isn't enough skill across the continent to take advantage of what's there so far. It could still be so much better. And when you look at a very small initiative that we've said, training 1 million Africans over the next 12 months in digital skills, it's really just a drop in the ocean. We need to be a lot more ambitious. We need to have more companies, more organizations, more governments joining in this initiative, because that's when you can get a small mom and pop shop, as you said, going beyond the neighbor, the boundaries, and really building a business that then they can start getting more people, more money, employing more people within those organizations. And that all comes down to the element I had mentioned earlier of increased spending power that then allows more people to come online and actually afford that. So it's a virtuous circle.
Yes, please.
I would just add one thing on what Honorable Minister said, and I really do believe that to reach the last of the last, there may need to be a conversation on what business model works for the rural area, because we cannot advance and leave the people in the rural areas behind.
No.
So new
But I mean,
business
on this, I think we have quite a large spectrum of what works and doesn't work in various countries, various continents on e-trade, e-commerce. I mean, how do you start an e-business? I mean, there's already quite a lot of experience in there, and you're absolutely right. It may not work if you are on a very remote place, far from the sort of cluster which have seen the emergence of that. I think it's time to go to the audience. If you have short points to make, suggestions, and we're also here to try and, get a bit of an operational conclusion if possible. Suggestions, questions, either general questions which in the final tour de table the panelists will make, or directly addressed to one of the panelists. There must be a microphone. Yeah, thanks. Please, and if you don't mind, tell us who you are.
Okay, the name is Lavmo Gomera. I'm from MMI Holdings. Just interesting conversation, by the way, and very important to Africa. My thoughts are around POPI, protection of personal information, and the issue of confidence in terms of uptake of internet by a lot of our people. I think the risks that come with it are the ones that sort of hold back. You might have the infrastructure put in place, but is it being utilized fully? Is the uptake there, or people are still very skeptic about their private information? Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, please. Lady here.
My name is Anne Erickson of PwC. I think my contribution is around perhaps the need for the financial services sector to feature in this conversation. Because if you're talking about transformation, I guess we're talking about economic and demographic conversation. And so to what extent is either our regulations or the way we do business in Africa not supportive of a digital environment that can help us move from where we are into the future?
Thank you. Yeah, there is a question there, and then there is a lady which I think I know at the back of the room.
Mine is not a question, but my name is Jimmy Awoshika. I work for Publicis in Nigeria. I think the point made by Minister Cwele, I'm sorry, I hope I've called him correctly, actually, and supported by one or two other speakers, speaks to the larger issue of ensuring that instead of having the networks compete on infrastructure, if we can't get the infrastructure built and have the networks now to concentrate on providing the services, we'll quickly get all of this sorted out. What most of the networks do is actually to invest a substantial amount of money in infrastructure that really doesn't cover anything. And what they do is, of course, they've got to, these are businesses. They've got to, in the short term, try to make the money. And they will try to concentrate their investment in areas where they think the returns will be highest. I mean, if you take Nigeria, that's exactly what's happening. Everybody competes on infrastructure. But if you also think about what we're trying to do in Nigeria, though with little success for now, but I think over time it's going to be successful, in breaking up the electricity board and ensuring that you can have transmission handled by government, and then everybody now can focus on distribution to particular areas. The services will over time now go up, and then costs will over time come down, and you'll have access by most people. And I think that that's actually something that we need to think about. I think what you guys are talking about is about the best thing that's actually going to happen to this continent. But we need two things. We need the governments to get involved, and we need the will. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Arantxa González, Executive Director of the International Trade Center, the development agency of the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. Just this morning, I joined the Minister for Industry and Trade of Rwanda and the Minister for ICT in Rwanda to launch an e-commerce platform here in Kigali to help the SMEs get into trade through e-commerce, called madeinrwanda.com, for those of you who are interested. In addition to the many issues that you raised, actually the discussion focused more on how can we get the SMEs to use e-commerce as the platform to get to markets. Financial services, payment systems, logistics and warehousing, and quality standards for those products to get to the customers were mentioned as the key three constraints that SMEs face. So I just thought that I would bring this. In addition to the hard infrastructure, we also need to look at all the little nuts and bolts of the soft infrastructure that are going to be, will have to be addressed by policymakers and businesses to make this a reality. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, what I understand your point is that there may be sort of digital specific issues, but there are also a number of issues that are not digital specific, which you have in trading more on this continent, whether within or with the rest of the world, which are classical, well-known issues having to do with logistics, availability of the chain code, and standardization for food and services. And that's absolutely correct. Assuming we, this afternoon, solve the issue of access, which we've nearly done, I think, assuming we've done that, there's still quite a number of issues which are not specific to digital trade. Other questions coming from the, sorry, yeah, here.
Hi there, good afternoon. My name is Ashley Bogue. I'm the Chief Business Officer from SAP. So I really have a comment. So I mean, when we talk about access, we've done a couple of pilot projects in different countries. One of them was how do we link rural retailers, so spaza shops we call them in South Africa, to the supply chain? How do we make their lives easier? Likewise, we've linked them also with dumb devices, not necessarily smart devices, in other industries. We've worked in Ghana on the shea butter project. How do we link agriculture? So farmers that are doing basically farming for themselves, and how do we link them into the big agricultural picture? And what we found in doing that was creating those linkages automatically provided incentive for businesses to invest, whether it's a wholesaler, whether it's someone in the healthcare industry, etc. So I believe that actually if we get together with government, we can find a lot more ways in which we can cooperate. Pilots like that create the incentive for business to invest and recognize these markets, banking the unbanked in rural areas. And there are multiple examples like that. So I believe just by creating that momentum for business gives them incentive to invest and continue. So I believe that if we create a platform to discuss these and come up with the right ideas, we can certainly bring some new innovations and open up those markets.
But stepping on your experience as SAP on this continent, are there countries that have done well in what you suggest to do and others less well? Can you give us examples of where it worked better than elsewhere?
So that's an interesting question. So I mean, we've asked ourselves this question too, and funnily enough, we've actually found that almost everywhere we've gone, it's worked pretty well. There's definitely the interest, there's the will. People, even in the rural areas, are very excited about technology and they're absolutely interested in it. So we haven't found that it works better one place than another. I think the key is really about finding the right partners to work with to make it real, right? So how do we interact with government so that we get the buy-in to drive projects like that? So geographically, I don't believe there's any very much difference. I think it's finding the right seeds and the right partners.
But I mean, again, in your experience, are there governments on this continent whom you feel have done the right thing and others who lagging behind? Are there examples? I mean, I'm trying to get you to give us a name. I know. If I were in your boots, I would hesitate to do that, but I'm not in your boots.
Absolutely. So, okay, I'll give you 3 examples. So perhaps we've had some very good successes in Ivory Coast, great collaborations with government and private companies. We've had excellent collaboration in Ghana, South Africa, excellent collaboration. I'd say those are 3 outstanding examples. Having said that, we clearly haven't had the opportunity to be able to go across the whole continent.
Well done, and thanks for playing the game and answering the question. That's good, a good thing to do. Now, are there any other observations or questions? Yeah, please, here.
Thank you. It's Frank Koska from Microsoft. I wanted to ask the panel a question around unlicensed access and the extraordinary case of Wi-Fi. Affordability is a global issue. 19% of Americans who have access to broadband can't afford it, just as an example. But in Spain, 82% of mobile traffic is offloaded to Wi-Fi. So why aren't we making more spectrum available on an unlicensed basis across the continent?
Yeah, you assume spectrum allocation is done through licensing.
Yeah, Wi-Fi is unlicensed spectrum, so 5 and 2.4 is unlicensed spectrum.
Yeah. Okay, time to go back to the panel. So, I think we've clearly identified access as number 1. This being a problem of availability of infrastructure, of integration of infrastructures, making them interoperable. Also an issue of regulatory issues, the one that was just mentioned, which is one. The one which you mentioned about, which was mentioned about data, property, privacy. This issue of trust, which Minister Cwele mentioned. So, and then assuming this is done, there's the whole issue of how to incentivize businesses, and notably small, remote, geographically spread out businesses to connect once the connection is available. So that's what I think we get to the discussion at this stage. For your final 2 minutes each, where would you put the major efforts not 20 years from now, not 10 years from now, next month, next year? What's your answer to that?
I was still thinking, but I think partnership. I'd put it in partnership with all stakeholders.
So sort of public-private partnerships,
Yes,
business partnering with
it's going
public
to take
institutions,
everybody. It's going
civil
to take
society,
everybody to get this to work.
NGOs.
Everybody.
And how do you do that? How do you incentivize this partnership? How do you trigger the sort of energy that will make people get there?
So a discussion like this, I think, is a good start because when I say partnership, we all have our core competencies. So there are areas that government is good at, there are areas that certain industry is good at, and there are areas that we need to hear from the users. So I just think that a discussion like this is a good start, and then create frameworks to move from discussion to implementation.
Thanks. Tobias.
Well, I think the key takeaway for me is giving access to internet plus giving access to market and electric power. We have those three elements. The rest is then the personal spirit of people, and there I'm a helpless optimist. I believe in people's entrepreneurial spirit and ideas to survive.
Yeah, and I mean, let me just repeat the point you made at the beginning, that access to power, of course, that's an ABB topic, but access to power is also part of this digital revolution, in that you can provide sort of wireless power as opposed to the old system of hardware grids, which now have to work both ways. There's an element there of jump in technology, which in your view facilitates this process.
Yes. Because access to power is like access to internet. It's an enabler. It's of course for us it's a business in itself. For Google it is, for Qualcomm it is, for ABB it is, but for the rest, for the majority, it's just the enabler. So it needs to be affordable, it needs to be smart, it needs to be rolled out in a way that people can actually take advantage
Thanks
of.
a lot. Minister, what are you going to tell President Zuma? Back from here, he said, well, you know, I sent you to this WEF in Kigali. What's your take in one sentence for the president to do?
Basically the partnership. I really like to emphasize that. Maybe just to say, because we're dealing with technology is changing everything. It's changing industry, it's changing business, it's changing society. So if we don't partner and have the shared vision about the impact of the ICT in society and business and government, and that's how we can build the national trust first among ourselves, that as government we've got no intention to kill the industry, and the industry's got no intention to reap the citizens and so on. So we're all working for the development of our nations. In Africa, lastly, I think the challenges we have in South Africa, in Africa in general, we must not take them as challenges. They are big opportunities for innovation. And the public partnerships I really like to leave with you, which we have experienced last year. Some of you have seen South Africa was experiencing a lot of load shedding in the electricity field. By just partnering with the private sector and creating a conducive environment for them to invest in alternative and cleaner energies, that program has been the most successful program driven by the private sector working with government. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Education. Education. I will send everyone to digifyafrica.com. Please write that down, because we believe that by educating people and giving them the tools to take advantage of the internet and the web will revolutionize resources and people's fate. So for me, it's education, going back to the old saying, you know, teach a man to fish. And so that's what we need to do. Thank you.
Yeah. Very good. We are right in time. Not easy to wrap up totally, but obviously I think, a confirmation by the members of this panel that the potential is there, that there is a huge pot of economic and social development available. And what you've just said is it will be done better sort of together, with a sort of shared vision, with a larger scale in terms of integration of infrastructures and software and accessibility, what you talked about this notion of a partnership, education, all things which are rather sort of familiar. Thanks for being with us. Thanks for the way you've answered the question, you've interacted. I think it was a lively session, which is what we need. And thanks to all of you for being here. Bye.